My wife went out to a couple's party with another man. I heard the news by chance, a conversation between friends on the speakerphone in her car, left in the back seat. It echoed in my head for hours, as if each word were a shard of glass being pushed against my chest. I didn't confront her, I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just went home and wrote the divorce letter. Not out of anger, but out of love. The kind of love that doesn't make a sound when it dies. It just silences everything. When she returned from the party, impeccable hair, slightly red eyes, expensive perfume hiding some guilt, the letter was on the kitchen table, next to our wedding photo. She opened it. Read it. And her heart froze. Not because I'd filed for divorce, but because between the lines, she understood, I knew. I knew everything. I knew about the rented dress, the restaurant reservation, the hotel, the man. And more than that, I knew she hadn't been mine again for a long time. She tried to say something, but there was no more room for words. Her hands trembled, and the silence between us seemed to scream everything that still needed to be said. Regret washed over her as quickly as the guilt had abandoned her that night. She looked at me with pleading eyes, but without the courage to utter a plea for forgiveness. And then, she just left. She packed her small bags and left without looking back. I thought it was final. I thought time and the weight of her mistake would fall on her hard enough to make her return. But the days passed. The nights too. And she didn't come back. She didn't text. She didn't call. She didn't ask if I was okay, if I ate, if I slept, if I cried. So, I decided to move on. At first, everything was dark. Sleeping in such a large, empty bed felt like punishment. But little by little, the pain settled into a less painful corner of my chest, and the space previously occupied by memories was filled with new possibilities. I met a woman who, over time, made me laugh again. Made me look at life with less suspicion. Made me relearn how to be light. She didn't make me forget, but she showed me that love can also be kind after chaos. And while I walked toward peace, she, on the other side, was crumbling. In the early days, still intoxicated by the taste of freedom, she believed she could simply start over. But soon came the silences, the emptiness, the automatic gestures that once made sense because someone was there to welcome them. The coffee at the wrong time. The pillow arranged on the left side. His slippers no longer under the bed. The details began to hurt more than the act of leaving itself. And then came the longing. The kind that hides behind the little things, the kind that bites at the corners of routine. She began to see me in everything. In the sound of the kettle boiling, in the music playing at the market, in the smell of the soap we used on the bed linens. She tried to resist. She tried to occupy her mind with new commitments, new clothes, new people. But nothing fulfilled her. Nothing soothed her. Nothing replaced her. And that's when she understood, she hadn't lost a man. She had lost the love of her life. Because true love isn't the kind that comes with butterflies, but the kind that endures even when everything around it turns to mud. And when she decided to look for me, when she finally had the courage to return to that house where every corner carried the sound of my absence, I was already with someone else. And the worst part wasn't seeing that, the worst part was seeing how peaceful I was. She saw me smiling. She saw me light. And she realized that, even my absence, was more alive than the presence of any other man who crossed her path. We met. And her gaze was the same as before, but without the same strength. She wanted me to come back. But all I could see was a story with too many full stops to be rewritten. I told her I forgave her. And I said it with a clear heart. Because forgiving isn't forgetting, it's just understanding that certain pains don't deserve to be carried for so long. But I also said it was too late now. Because loving isn't enough. Sometimes love dies on the side of the road, when someone chooses another direction. And she did. Today, she still lives among memories. Among gestures left unsaid, kisses left unsaid, messages left unsent. I live another story, and this time, I'm the one loved without needing to beg for presents. But sometimes, when I lie down and stare at the ceiling, I still find myself wondering. What if she had come back a day sooner? What if that divorce letter had been burned instead of delivered? What if forgiveness had come with enough time to rebuild what was broken? But she didn't come. And that's why everything changed. She had everything. And traded it for one night. Now she has nothing, and I have peace. But do you know the exact moment she realized she'd lost everything? It was a random morning, after weeks without me, when she, distracted, called my name out loud, and realized she was alone. The cup fell to the floor, coffee spilling onto the cold tile. And the echo of my name in that empty kitchen was the saddest sound she'd ever heard. But what she did next, was what surprised me the most. Because no one could have imagined the way she chose to face her own regret. Not even me. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any kind of betrayal. All stories are fictional, created to show, in an intense and realistic way, how betrayal can destroy lives, families and hearts. Our goal is clear: alert, excite and reflect. Get ready now to dive into another story, shocking, unforgettable, and that will move you from start to finish. Good story. Jason and Emily were the kind of couple who, when seen together, aroused a mixture of admiration and discreet envy in those who knew them. She, with a serene smile and eyes brimming with sweetness, seemed born to light up a room. He, with his firm voice and welcoming presence, carried in his gaze the tranquility of someone who knows how to care, protect, and love. They had been married for 11 years, but seemed to share a rare, almost silent connection, the kind that lasts far beyond the years counted on the calendar. They had a simple but cozy home, with large windows through which the sun streamed generously every morning. The front garden was carefully maintained by Jason, who liked to tend the flowers as if he were tending his own marriage, with patience and consistency. Emily, in turn, liked to fill the spaces with small details: candles, pictures with positive quotes, pillows in soft colors, as if to tell the world that within there was peace. They didn't have children, but they had plans. They had dreams nurtured calmly, promises whispered during rainy nights, trips jotted down in old notebooks, and a list of places they wanted to see together. Sundays were sacred, with hearty breakfasts and long walks in the park, followed by afternoons where she painted while he listened to music and read. They respected each other's silences, which made them seem even closer. There was a complicity in the way they shared household chores, in the casual touch on the shoulder as they passed each other in the hallway, in the glances exchanged at dinner even when the topic had run dry. Everything seemed exactly as it should be. But there was a nuance, a small crack imperceptible to the naked eye, that slowly crept between them, not like an earthquake, but like a seepage. Jason was analytical, methodical, and extremely dedicated to his work. A civil engineer, he spent long hours in the office or on construction sites, always striving to deliver the best in each project. Emily understood, at least initially, that this effort was part of their commitment to the life they wanted to build. However, as the years passed, his absences began to leave their mark. Small gaps at dinners, birthdays celebrated with half the table occupied, trips cancelled due to unavoidable commitments. As a visual artist, her heart was more focused on the symbolic, on details, on silent gestures. She lived the present intensely and expected the same from others. Despite being understanding, Emily began to hold back words, smiles, and even wishes. Their once constant dialogue became more occasional, and spontaneous touching became routine. But still, there was affection between them, and this affection kept them together even when their schedules seemed to clash. The couple's circle of friends was small but solid. They shared occasional dinners, birthdays, and a few more formal parties. One of these friends, Noah and Laura, were always present. Noah was the outgoing, fun-loving, and somewhat irreverent type, while Laura was more discreet and observant. Emily and Laura's friendship oscillated between closeness and a slight distance. It wasn't that there was any distrust, but Laura was the type of person who observed more than she spoke, and Emily sensed it. Even so, it was with Noah that Emily got along best. They laughed easily, exchanged inside jokes, and talked about art and cinema for hours, always respecting the implicit boundaries that relationships require. Jason never showed jealousy. He trusted Emily with an almost sacred conviction. And perhaps for this reason, he never considered that excessive affection, when not shared, ends up spilling over into other places. Over time, the routine settled in firmly. Mornings became quiet, coffees taken at different times. Emily woke earlier, enjoying the freshness of the day to paint, to feel in touch with the emotions that only the early hours of the morning awakened. Jason, more of a nocturnal person, always slept a little longer, often already mentally immersed in the day's spreadsheets and meetings. They still loved each other, but the love wasn't as evident as before. It became implicit, unspoken, veiled in actions rather than words. Emily, though grateful, missed feeling seen. And it wasn't just a romantic need. It was existential. She missed hearing her name lightly, being looked at with admiration, being truly desired. And this lack, though never confessed, began to rumble inside. Jason, for his part, believed he was on the right path. He worked more, earned more, made bigger plans, as if a fulfilling life were limited to stability and security. He didn't realize that in the process of building the future, he was losing the present. Saturday nights, once filled with movies and glasses of wine, became lonely. Emily began accepting invitations to exhibitions and coffee dates with friends while Jason continued on to meetings or preferred to rest. The distance wasn't overt, but it was clear. They both felt it. They both knew. But they pretended not to notice, like someone ignoring a wound for fear of discovering it needs to be cut open to heal. And then came the invitation to a party. A couple's party, the kind they usually went to together, but this time Jason casually declined. He said he was tired, that he promised himself a night of rest. Emily hesitated for a few seconds, but agreed to go alone. After all, they were longtime friends, everyone there knew each other. There was no harm in that. Or at least, that's what she told herself. The house was quiet that night. Jason went to bed early, watched half a documentary, and fell asleep on the couch with his phone by his side. He woke in the middle of the night, looked at the clock, and noticed Emily hadn't returned yet. He found it strange for a brief moment, but then mentally explained, maybe she was sleeping at Laura's, as she had done before. He went back to sleep. The next day, he made coffee, as he did on many Sundays. Emily arrived shortly before noon, her hair tied up messily and a slightly distant look in her eyes. She kissed him on the cheek and told him it had been a pleasant evening, but that she was exhausted. Jason didn't question it. He just smiled, poured her a cup of coffee, and told her about an interesting documentary he'd watched. She listened in silence, sipping her coffee slowly, as if trying to keep something inside her chest still. The following days passed with the normalcy they had both learned to enact. Work, quiet dinners, a few touches, kind words, but nothing that broke the surface. Until, one day, Jason came home early. There was no specific reason, just an impulse. He bought flowers, as he had in the early years of their marriage, and decided to prepare something special for dinner. He entered the house with a light heart, believing that this gesture could rekindle something he knew was sluggish. He didn't find her in the living room. Or in the bedroom. Or in the studio. The house was silent. Only her cell phone, forgotten on the porch chair, vibrated with unread messages. Jason grabbed it on impulse. Maybe it was something urgent. Maybe he could help. And then, without wanting to, or wanting too much, he saw it. But that's a story that still needs to be told. Jason stood there for a few minutes, standing in front of Emily's phone, as if the small device had gained an absurd weight in his hands. The still-lit screen displayed notifications, a string of messages that seemed part of a recent conversation. He hesitated before unlocking it. It wasn't like him to invade spaces that weren't his, never had been, but something about that night, in that gesture of trying to reignite what was dying, pushed him toward a strange sense of urgency. Maybe it was the silence of the house, or the fact that for the first time in a long time, he'd felt the urge to surprise her. The urge to try again. And now, all of that seemed to echo in vain. The unlocked screen revealed a familiar name. Jason felt a chill run down his spine, an icy chill creeping up the back of his neck as if something invisible had touched him. He didn't need to open the entire conversation. Just the previews of the messages said more than any confession could offer. Laughter, compliments, disguised codes, small details that only make sense between two bodies that recognize each other in intimacy. He couldn't tell if what he felt was anger, sadness, or a disbelief so profound it paralyzed him. He sat on the arm of the sofa, cell phone still in hand, and tried to take a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. Emily arrived moments later, carrying grocery bags and saying something about the traffic. When she realized he wasn't answering, she paused in the living room doorway. Her eyes went straight to the phone in his hand, and the brief second she stopped breathing was all Jason needed to confirm what he didn't want to know. There was no fuss, no raised voices. Just a hard, dense silence, like shattered glass stuck in his throat. Jason simply stood, handed her the phone, and went for a walk. Night had fallen with a different weight that day, and the air felt thicker, as if laden with everything that had been trapped between them for so long. Emily didn't follow. She sat where he had been and stared at her screen like someone staring at a shattered mirror. She knew this moment would come, but she'd always believed she could perhaps avoid it. But she couldn't. And now, the world that had been carefully constructed over the past few years was beginning to crumble at the edges. In the days that followed, the house became a gray landscape of silent footsteps and averted glances. Emily tried to occupy herself with her paintings, but the brush no longer obeyed. The colors ran from her hands, and the lines seemed all blurred by guilt. Jason, for his part, spent more time away. He returned late, often after she had gone to bed, and refused to engage in conversations that required explanations. He didn't want to hear excuses. He didn't want to understand. I just wanted the right to feel what I needed to feel. To fall apart in silence. Meals were short, breakfast eaten at different times, their eyes no longer met, as if the weight of simple eye contact was enough to trigger an even greater fall. But still, neither of them mentioned the word betrayal. She knew he knew, and he knew she knew there was no hiding it anymore. But the name of the mistake hovered like a ghost in the air, present but untouchable. On a cloudy afternoon, Jason went to the office early and asked for a few days off. He said he needed some time off, perhaps traveling, to clear his head. His colleagues, surprised by the sudden change in behavior, didn't question him. He'd always been reliable, upright, and dedicated. If he said he needed time, it was because he truly did. He spent the rest of the day driving aimlessly, listening to old songs, churning through thoughts that seemed unwilling to be organized. At some point in the evening, he stopped in front of a modest hotel and decided to spend the night there. He wanted to sleep away from the walls that now held memories distorted by heartbreak. He lay down, not hungry, not sleepy, just with his heart pounding in his chest like a silent siren. He thought of everything they'd built, the nights they'd loved each other without fear, the letters exchanged in the early years, the impromptu dinners with cheap wine and sincere laughter. He thought of how all of that, now, seemed like another world. A world that existed before everything fell apart. Emily, alone in the house, paced in circles. She tried to write, tried to paint, tried to sleep, but everything seemed to resist her touch. She called her mother, tried to keep the conversation light, but her choked voice gave her away. She hung up before it broke. She considered calling Jason, but didn't know what to say. Any word seemed too small compared to what she'd done. She knew she'd hurt him in a way that perhaps even she couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't just his body he'd given to another. It was their trust, their intimate space, now invaded by a mistake that could not be undone. She tried to convince herself it wasn't out of malice, that she'd lost herself amid emotional abandonment, loneliness, and the desire to be noticed. But still, she knew nothing justified it. The mistake was entirely hers. And the weight of it was beginning to suffocate her. Jason returned 2 days later. He entered the house without a word. Emily was waiting for him on the couch, her eyes begging for any sign of openness. But he simply went to his bedroom, took a long shower, and lay down. There were no more arguments. Just a sea of pent-up feelings that neither of them seemed able to touch. The next day, he didn't go to work. He stayed home, making coffee as usual, and sat at the table. Emily approached, hesitant. He looked her in the eyes for the first time in days. And in that look, there was raw pain, but also something else. Something she couldn't name. It was then that he spoke, his voice firm but low. He said he knew. That he had read it. That he understood. Emily just cried. She didn't try to defend herself, didn't search for words. She just let the tears flow like a speechless confession. Jason took a deep breath and said he needed some time. That he still didn't know what he would do, but he couldn't keep pretending. He said maybe it would be best for them to stay away for a while. Emily tried to argue, but her voice was lost in her tears. He didn't shout, didn't blame, just said the words with a cruel serenity, like someone accepting a pain they didn't choose to feel. That night, he slept in the guest room. Emily lay in the empty bed, staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers in the cracks in the wood. She remembered the first few nights there, the conversations lying side by side, the plans whispered before bed. And now, the silence was so loud it seemed painful. She lay awake for hours, going over everything she could have done differently. But it was too late. The past was already written. And the present, now, was the punishment for every choice made. The next day, Jason left early. He left a short note, "I'll be back later. I need to think." Emily sat there at the table, paper in hand, her heart in pieces. She knew she had crossed a line. And what tore her apart was the realization that there might be no going back. What she didn't yet know, was that there was something more. Something Jason had discovered beyond the betrayal. Something she never would have imagined. And that would make everything even harder to bear. The end began to take shape on a cloudy afternoon, when Jason returned home after days away, his expression artificially serene, barely concealing the turmoil consuming him. Emily waited for him in the same place as always, now with tired eyes and a heart too heavy for words. She had prepared herself for everything, except for what was to come. Jason entered, dropped his keys on the table, and walked toward her slowly. For a moment, it seemed he might say something soft, but as he sat across from her, his voice sounded firm and measured. He said he had spent the last few days trying to understand, searching within himself for some part of himself that could still sustain that wounded love, but that he had stumbled upon a specific memory, one that would no longer leave him alone. Emily frowned in confusion, but remained silent, listening, as if accepting that whatever comes, will come as it must. Jason then took a deep breath and told her what he'd discovered. He said that after the first night he read those messages, something disturbed him more than the content itself. It was the way she spoke to the other man, the terms, the nicknames, the dates, there was something there that didn't fit with recent times. That's what drove him to investigate further. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. He needed to understand the depth of it, needed to know when she'd stopped being his alone. And then, among old records, cloud-archived photos, and restored phone data, he found it. A history of calls and conversations that dated back much further than he'd imagined. Longer than that party. Even before their wedding anniversary the year before. Emily lowered her eyes as she listened, her fingers clenching in suppressed nervousness. Jason continued, his voice lower but still controlled. He said that, in the midst of these searches, he also found a video. A short video, accidentally recorded by herself, it seemed, during a video call. There was no nudity, no kissing, but enough to dispel any doubts about the kind of relationship she had with that man. The date of the video coincided with the weekend he had traveled to visit his parents alone because she claimed to be having a migraine. That memory hit him like a blow, now filled with a new meaning that almost made him choke. But that wasn't what hurt the most. What destroyed him most was the comment he heard in the background of the video, said by her with laughter, when he thought the call had already ended. She said Jason was good, a decent, hard-working man, but that she truly felt alive with the other man. She said that with Jason, everything was predictable, too calm, without that tension that made her body tremble. She said it was strange, because she loved Jason, but it was like loving a brother, someone who cares but no longer awakens the desire to be touched. Jason didn't shout as he said it. He just let the words come out like someone pouring poison from within their own body. Emily was paralyzed. Her hands trembled, and the tears began to flow before she knew it. She tried to say she didn't remember saying it, that maybe she was confused, that she didn't mean it that way. But each attempt felt like another razor. Jason stood, ran his hands through his hair, and turned away for a second. When he turned back, his eyes were watering, but his voice was still intact. He said that there, in that video, he not only saw the betrayal, but heard what she really thought of him. And that hurt more than the act itself. It was like discovering that all the years he'd lived with her had been spent with a false version of himself. As if she'd kept quiet for so long and, in that carelessness, let the truth out. Emily, now overcome with despair, tried to hold his hand, pleading with her eyes, telling him she'd made the worst mistake of her life, that it didn't mean what it seemed. But Jason pulled away. He said that even if he forgave the betrayal, and part of him could even understand the emotional hole that had led her there, he didn't know if he could forgive that sentence. That damned sentence, uttered amidst laughter, that redefined everything he thought he meant to her. Emily fell to her knees on the floor, crying, her face in her hands, as Jason walked toward the door. He didn't leave. He stopped, took a deep breath, and returned only to tell her he didn't hate her. That what he felt, in truth, was an immense, almost unbearable sadness. Because he would have done anything to win her back if she had told him she needed him. He would have changed, retraced his steps, learned to love her differently if she had asked. But she chose silence. And in that silence, she destroyed everything. She told him she loved her, still loved him, but that she couldn't stay there anymore. Because love, no matter how strong, doesn't survive the absence of respect. And much less the absence of truth. She asked him to stay, even if it was in the other room. She asked him to give her more time. That they could rebuild everything together, starting from scratch. But he was already at the end of the road. He had already overcome the pain. What came next was no longer reconciliation. It was the acceptance that not all love is enough. That sometimes, the ones we love most are the very ones who break us inside. He left the house that night without saying when he would be back. And this time, there was no note. Just the sound of the door gently closing, like a silent goodbye. Emily stood there, alone in the room, surrounded by everything she had built alongside him. Every object, every corner, now echoed with a deafening emptiness. And in that deep silence, she understood. It wasn't her body he was taking away. It was love. It was peace. It was the home he represented. And for the first time since it all began, she felt she had lost him forever. But what she didn't yet know, was that the true punishment was yet to come. And it wouldn't be meted out by Jason. It would be meted out by life itself. Jason walked away unhurriedly, as if each step were a silent farewell to what he tried to save for so long. There were no more tears in his eyes, just a deep, dry look, the kind of look of someone who's understood that certain departures don't need to be announced aloud. It was early evening when he arrived at the hotel where he would spend the next few days. The room was small, with a single window draped in beige curtains and the low sound of cars passing in the distance. He dropped his suitcase on the floor, took off his shoes, and lay on his back for a while, not moving anything, just listening to the noise of the world outside as if trying to make sense of the most banal things. He thought about how much he'd changed in the last few months, about everything he'd lost for someone who, in the end, no longer even saw him. It was as if he'd lived with a stranger who perfectly imitated the role of his wife. A convincing actress, who knew his schedule, his expressions, his quirks, but who silently withdrew a little further each day without him noticing. That night, he dreamed of his wedding day. He dreamed of Emily smiling among white flowers, saying yes with teary eyes, swearing eternal love while the whole world seemed to stop around him. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart racing, and a sick feeling in his stomach, as if he'd lost something he'd never truly had. He sat on the edge of the bed, rubbed his face with both hands, and stared into space. He knew he couldn't live in that room forever. He knew life had to go on. But how does one go on when everything that was home turns to ruin? Emily, meanwhile, spent her days wandering the house like a ghost, touching objects as if trying to extract from them a glimpse of the time when everything was still simple and whole. She turned off her phone for 2 days, refusing to listen to anyone but him. She didn't go to work, didn't paint, didn't eat properly. She just cried. Sometimes silently, sometimes in tears. Regret consumed her, not just for the betrayal, but for the way she destroyed someone who'd never stopped being by her side, even when she didn't deserve it. A regret that didn't ask for forgiveness, but rather begged for a chance to go back to before the mistake. And that chance, she knew, no longer existed. On the 4th day, Jason decided to leave. He needed to breathe fresh air, see new faces. He walked to a coffee shop near the hotel and ordered a strong coffee. While waiting, he noticed a woman sitting alone, reading a book he also knew. They exchanged brief glances, a shy smile of literary recognition, nothing more. But in that small gesture, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, lightness. It was as if, for a brief moment, the world wasn't entirely on his shoulders. She smiled back, and he lowered his eyes, as if ashamed of his own reaction. Still, as he left the coffee shop, he felt a little more whole. Emily decided to write. Not a message, not a request, but a letter. A long letter. She wrote with tears in her eyes, trying to weave into words everything she hadn't been able to say out loud. She spoke of how much she'd lost herself, of how she sought to fill the voids she'd created, of the days when he slept and she cried silently, wishing she were someone else. She said that, with the other man, she hadn't found love, but a comfortable illusion, and that now this illusion left her empty and cold inside. She asked for forgiveness. Not to return, but to ease both their hearts. She folded the letter carefully, put it in a plain envelope, and left it with the doorman of the building where Jason was staying. She didn't know if he would read it. But she had to. When Jason received the envelope, he hesitated. He considered throwing it away, burning it, ignoring it. But there was something different about that shaky handwriting. He opened it. He read it over and over. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just read. And in the end, he felt a different kind of pain, no longer anger, nor disappointment, but a quiet compassion. Like someone watching a wounded bird trying to fly with a broken wing. He considered writing back, but he knew that words can't change what time has already transformed. And so, he put the letter in his wallet and went for a walk. A few weeks passed. Jason returned home only to retrieve the rest of his things. Emily wasn't there. She'd left a key with the neighbor and gone to spend a few days with her parents. The house was different. Colder, emptier, quieter. He gathered up the remaining books, some clothes, and personal belongings, but as he passed the porch, he saw the easel with a blank canvas. He approached. Beside it, a small post-it note stuck to the wood. Just 3 words, "I still think about you." That made him smile. But not with joy. It was a melancholic smile, the kind you get when there's no longer any struggle, only acceptance. He decided to move to a new apartment. A smaller place, but with enough natural light and silence to regroup his thoughts. Little by little, he resumed his work projects, rekindled old friendships, and returned to places he'd previously avoided. It was during this rebuilding phase that he met the woman from the coffee shop again. Her name was Clara. Simple, direct, with the eyes of someone who's experienced loss but still believes in new beginnings. They began with casual conversations, unpretentious coffees, and shy laughter. Jason didn't fall in love immediately. He didn't want that. But little by little, without realizing it, he began to feel safe with her. She was different. Clara didn't resemble Emily at all. And perhaps because of that, he was able to breathe easily with her. Emily, upon returning home and seeing the rest of his things gone, felt the final blow. It was as if life was telling her, without speaking, that now she would have to learn to live without him. She sat on the living room floor and cried for the last time. There was nothing left to be done. There was no patching up, no going back. Only a new, lonely path she would have to walk with the weight of everything she had caused. She began to avoid the places they frequented together, changed her haircut, redecorated some rooms, but no external adjustment was enough to change what hurt inside. Regret, that one thing, wouldn't budge. Months later, by chance or a twist of fate, the two crossed paths in a bookstore. It was quick, unexpected. Jason was with Clara, smiling naturally. Emily had seen them before but didn't look away. He approached, smiled gently, and greeted her. Jason returned the smile. Clara, kindly, sensed the weight of their encounter and respected their silence. There was no long exchange of words, just looks that said it all. Emily resisted the urge to ask how he was. She knew. He was fine. He was at peace. And that was what hurt the most. That night, alone in her room, she dreamed of him again. But in the dream, he didn't recognize her. He passed her by like a stranger. And that made her wake with an emptiness that seemed to scream. For the first time, she accepted that she had lost not only the man she loved, but the version of herself that was better with him. And that, she would never see again. And that was when she understood that the true punishment wasn't living without him. It was living knowing that, even though she was forgiven, he had learned to be happy without her. Emily spent the days following her reunion with Jason immersed in a silent torpor, as if the world around her had lost its luster and every movement was made out of obligation rather than desire. The impact of seeing him well, whole, smiling sincerely alongside another woman, brought to the surface the wound she insisted on mending with memories and regrets. For the first time, it wasn't remorse for the mistake she'd made that overwhelmed her, but the stark realization that the man she destroyed with her emotional absence had learned to live without her. Jason now seemed light, his expression carrying a serene tranquility, and it pierced her like a blade. For a long time, she'd harbored the idea that, even with the pain, there was something between them that would always keep her present in his life, some silent longing, an absence that would make him think of her when he woke up, heard a song, or tasted a strong coffee. But that was no longer there. All that remained was her, alone with the memories of a past that no longer belonged to her. The nights became long again. Emily began to avoid mirrors, unable to recognize herself in that pale, melancholic image staring back at her. It wasn't just guilt that consumed her insides, it was the certainty that she had wasted something rare out of whim, out of insecurity, seeking in another what perhaps was only missing within herself. Over time, the paintings were set aside, the studio lost its soul, and the silence of the house began to seem unbearable. At times, she considered writing to him again, but she would back away before even picking up a pen. Any words would be useless now. He had forgiven her, yes, but not to get back together, but to move on. His pain was so great that it became a learning experience, and this learning experience helped him mature, while she remained behind, frozen in the moment of her wrong choice. Jason, on the other hand, though seemingly at peace, was still processing the scars left by what he'd experienced. His relationship with Clara had begun tentatively, but it grew stronger over time. She didn't pressure him, didn't demand promises, just offered her presence. And that, for him, was everything. The past still visited his thoughts from time to time, especially on quieter nights, when memory insisted on bringing back flashes of moments that would never return. But now, those thoughts didn't hurt as much. They were like an old photograph, yellowed and blurry, which he regarded with respect, but not with longing. Clara understood this space. She knew that love doesn't arise out of nowhere, that it needs to be nurtured, respected, and that, above all, it arises when there is truth. One day, while cleaning out the box of memories stored at the back of his closet, Jason found the letter Emily had written months earlier. He read it again, this time with a more distant gaze, as if analyzing someone else's pain. A lump rose in his throat, but he didn't cry. It was as if that pain now belonged to another time, to another man. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He considered replying, but knew there was nothing more to say. Silence between them was now the only form of respect possible. One Sunday, while walking with Clara through a craft fair, Jason saw an impromptu exhibition of paintings among the stalls. He approached out of curiosity and immediately recognized the style of the brushstrokes. The name on the sign confirmed it. They were Emily's works. Different, denser, more charged. There was pain in the colors, anguish in the forms. Clara noticed his gaze fixed on one of the canvases and waited in silence. Jason moved closer, read the short description next to the painting, and smiled, but sadly. He said nothing, just ran his fingers along the edge of the canvas, as if touching a ghost. Clara simply held his hand firmly. She didn't ask anything. She simply followed him silently as he walked away. Emily wasn't at the fair that day. The exhibition had been organized by a curator friend, who insisted on showing the world the work Emily produced during her sleepless nights. When she learned Jason had stopped by, she felt a mixture of shame and pride. Knowing he'd seen her work exposed her more than if they'd met face to face. The painting said everything she'd never been able to say. It was her way of screaming. But he just looked, understood, and left. Time marched on steadily. Emily began rebuilding her life, not as an attempt to forget, but as an attempt to rediscover herself. She entered therapy, reconnected with old friends, and began teaching painting classes to children at a public school. Little by little, she found a way to use her pain as a bridge to something new. She still loved Jason, and perhaps always would, but now she understood that love alone doesn't sustain anyone. That loving someone isn't enough if you don't know how to care for the love you've received. Jason, now lighter, moved on with his life with Clara. Over time, they began to share more than just coffee and outings. They built a relationship based on transparency, affection, and, above all, the desire to make it work without rushing. He knew the pain of the past had left its mark, but now, they no longer defined him. They were silent reminders of how much he had endured. He never spoke ill of Emily. He never exposed her, not even when he had every reason to. Whenever asked about the end of their marriage, he would simply say that they had gone their separate ways. Because, deep down, he still held her in high regard, something his pride couldn't erase. But love, that was in the past. One rainy afternoon, Jason and Clara were browsing a bookstore when they came across a section of old letters and handwritten poems. He chose a navy blue notebook and began writing right there. He wrote about new beginnings, about wounds that no longer bleed, about the peace that comes after the storm. Clara read over his shoulder, smiled, and hugged him. It was then that he understood, he no longer needed to fight what he felt. That story was over. Not with regret, but with dignity. Emily, on the other side of town, was closing her studio door after another day of classes. She carried paint on her fingers and a backpack on her back. She walked slowly to the bus stop, listening to soft music on her headphones. She looked up at the cloudy sky and took a deep breath. She knew that, even without a happy ending, she had learned something valuable, the price of choices, the value of true love, and the weight of an absence that would never be filled. And yet, she decided to carry on. Because living with regret is painful, but living without trying to be a better person would be even more so. And so, while one learned to love again, the other learned to forgive. Both on different paths, both forever touched by a story that transformed them. What remained now was the silence of real life, the one that comes after the last tear, the last unspoken word, the last goodbye with no return. A silence that no longer hurts, but also cannot be forgotten. Jason was waking up early now. His old habit of making 2 cups of coffee had been forgotten, but recently it had returned with new meaning. Clara usually woke up minutes later, always with her hair loose around her shoulders and that light gaze that demanded nothing, just presence. They shared the silence comfortably, each lost in their own thoughts as the morning light filtered through the thin curtains in the living room. There was peace there. A peace built on ruins, yet solid. That Tuesday, Jason watched Clara scribble sentences in her notebook, holding her mug with both hands. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for a brief moment he realized, there was no longer any weight inside him. The memory of Emily still existed, but had become a faint mark, like an old cut that time had softened. Clara watched him patiently. She knew he had scars, but she never asked him to forget them. That was what touched him most. The fact that she accepted him with all his history. That week, Jason received an unexpected call. He was the curator of a local gallery organizing an event about artists who transformed their pain into art. Emily's name had been suggested by one of the gallery's regulars. The curator knew of their long-standing connection and tactfully asked if Jason would like to attend the opening as a guest. It wasn't common, but since some of the paintings had been directly inspired by their relationship, he felt it was important to inquire. Jason was silent for a moment, surprised not by the call, but by the feeling it evoked. Part of him considered refusing immediately. But the other, more mature, more self-aware, decided it might be time to face everything head-on. He accepted the invitation. Clara supported him with a soft smile and said she would accompany him if he wanted. He nodded with a look that said more than any words. On the other side, Emily prepared for the exhibition with hushed anticipation. The paintings were arranged in chronological order, as if telling an unspoken story. The first phase featured vibrant colors, bold strokes, works created in the days when she still believed love was invincible. The following canvases delved into cooler tones, distorted brushstrokes, solitary figures. There was pain, regret, absence. The final works, however, were not sad. They were restrained, clean, almost silent. As if the artist was learning to accept. Emily knew Jason had confirmed his presence, and it made her tremble inside. She hadn't seen him up close since the day at the bookstore, and now he would be there, walking among paintings born of his absence. On the night of the exhibition, the gallery was packed, but for Jason, it felt as if everything around him faded into the background. Clara held his hand casually as they walked among the works. His heart beat fast, but not from fear or pain, but from a strange kind of respect. When he stopped before the central canvas, a large painting in which 2 figures seemed to be slowly moving away along a faded road, he stood motionless for several long seconds. He read the description beside it, "Last Crossing." The text simply said, "Some departures aren't physical. They're choices. And some choices hurt more than the absence itself." Clara watched him discreetly, respecting the silence that fell. Jason slowly released her hand and moved a little closer to the canvas. He felt a pang, but not the kind that hurts. It was more like recognition. A sign that this story had finally been understood and closed. Emily appeared minutes later, dressed in a sober dress and with her hair tied back in a loose bun. Seeing him in front of the canvas, her steps faltered, but she continued. She stopped a few feet away, waited for him to turn around. Jason saw her and smiled gently. There was no more hurt. Emily tried to smile back, but her throat tightened. He approached, and the silence between them was more eloquent than any conversation. She gathered her courage and said, in a low voice, that this painting had been the hardest to finish. That she had spent weeks resisting painting until she realized she had to do it for herself. Jason responded with a serene look. He said he understood. Emily then risked a question, "Are you happy?" He took a deep breath and answered without hesitation, "Yes. For the first time in a long time, I feel whole." She nodded, swallowing back the tear that threatened to fall. "I'm happy for you." Jason thanked her, placed a hand on her shoulder with a light gesture, and then walked away. Clara approached soon after. Jason welcomed her with a touch of the hand and led her to the rest of the gallery. Emily stood still, watching their backs, trying not to get lost in her own thoughts. It was in that moment that she understood that the greatest loss of her life wasn't the end of her marriage, nor even the distance that grew between them after their forgiveness. The real loss was no longer being part of the future of someone she loved. Now, she was the past. A memory that lives on in pictures and hidden words. But not in promises. The following week, Jason and Clara traveled. They rented a small cabin surrounded by trees and silence. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. During a night of light rain, Clara looked at him and said she'd never felt so safe with someone. Jason smiled and replied that with her, he didn't have to pretend to be strong all the time. There, he could just be. And that, for someone who spent years trying to fix something broken, was freedom. Emily, in turn, began attending artistic gatherings at libraries and universities. One day, during a lecture on pain as a catalyst for creation, she was invited to share her story. For the first time, she spoke publicly about lost love, how betrayals can be born of emptiness rather than malice, and how not all regrets find room for redemption. Her words were met with attentive silence. And at the end, one of the young people present approached her to say that her story had made him rethink his own actions. Emily cried. Not from the pain, but from realizing that her failure, however profound, had generated some learning outside of herself. Time marched on with dignity. Jason and Clara continued to build their own story, their past mistakes transformed into living lessons. Emily continued walking alone, but no longer dragging herself along. There were days when it still hurt, yes. But now, she knew how to deal with that pain. And even though the love of her life had moved on, she had finally found a place of peace where she could exist without constant blame. The story that once began with promises of eternity ended without shouting, without scandal, but with an irrefutable truth. Not every love survives a mistake, but every mistake can teach the value of a love that never returns. And although their reunion left emotions running high, both knew that from that point on, there was only one possible path, forward. One forward with a new love. And the other, with a new version of herself. Life moved on unhurriedly, as it does with everything that needs time to heal. Months turned into seasons, and the seasons became marks of the past that now only whispered memories instead of shouting longing. Jason and Clara had moved into a new house, with large windows and a simple backyard, where they sometimes planted herbs and flowers, but mostly silence. It wasn't a grand life, but it was full of small routines that only make sense to those who have understood the value of peace after war. The love between them grew in fertile soil, watered with patience, listening, and space. Jason was no longer the man who sought assurance of his worth in others' answers. He was now someone who was self-sufficient, someone who learned that loving another begins, inevitably, with not abandoning oneself. And Clara, with her serene sensitivity, never tried to occupy a place that wasn't hers. Instead, she built something new with him, without the intention of erasing the past, merely rendering it irrelevant to the present. Emily, for her part, rediscovered in art a greater purpose than any relationship could offer. Her teachings grew in reach, and her name began to circulate in academic and artistic circles as an example of someone who converted pain into expression. But deep down, far from the galleries and classrooms, she still faced nights of profound silence. Jason's absence no longer hurt like an open wound, but like the pain of a phantom limb, an absence the body insists on feeling, even after so long. One late afternoon, after a lecture on emotional reconstruction, an older woman approached her and said, you speak beautifully of guilt, but I can see in your eyes that you still hope for forgiveness from yourself." Emily smiled, her eyes brimming with tears, embraced the unknown woman, and there, without another word, understood that perhaps what she needed most was not Jason's forgiveness, but the liberation from the emotional prison she had built herself. One day, walking through a used book fair, Jason found a leather-bound notebook with blank pages. He felt the urge to write, not as a vent, but as a legacy. He began to keep a kind of diary, undated, simply filled with scattered thoughts about love, loss, choices, and rebuilding. Some pages were dedicated to Clara, others to the very silence she had learned to love. And in an unexpected moment, he wrote something he had kept hidden for years: "Not all betrayal is born of cruelty. Sometimes it is born of fear, of absence, of need. But none is easy for the betrayed. Forgiveness is not a return ticket, it is just a reminder that it is possible to move forward without hatred." He closed the notebook and kept it as if it were an amulet, not of protection, but of the long road he had traveled to this point. Fate, as it always does, still had its own whims. A year after the exhibition, a new curator organized a reunion for the artists who participated in the event. Jason was invited to give a testimony as a viewer whose life had been touched by the works. He considered refusing, but Clara encouraged him. That night, he spoke before a small audience about the power of art as a healing instrument. He didn't name names or detail incidents, simply sharing with admirable calm that love, when true, never ends in hate. That sometimes the most beautiful thing you can do for a story is to let it go with dignity. Emily watched from the back row, silent, her eyes moist, but without pain. Only gratitude. At the end, she approached, extended her hand, and for the first time in a long time, they both smiled lightly, as if they had finally managed to say goodbye without any regrets. Without wanting to return. Only with the mutual desire for each other to be happy. A few years passed. Jason and Clara were now expecting a child. The news came with a mixture of surprise and emotion. He felt overcome by a peace he never imagined he would feel again. It wasn't the beginning of a new life, it was the continuation of one that finally made sense. And as he set up the baby's room, amidst light paint and small furniture, Jason found within himself a kind of calm, mature happiness, born of the suffering he knew how to transform. Clara hugged him from behind whenever he paused silently to gaze at the crib, as if she knew he was conversing with a past that no longer weighed heavily. Emily, now with professional recognition and a new, more introspective life, decided to write a book based on her journey. It wasn't an autobiography. It was a fictional story, inspired by the real emotions she experienced, but told in a way that the reader could relate to without knowing its origin. She launched the book at a small cultural event, and to her surprise, it spread through groups of readers who found comfort in their own pain. In a special dedication, she wrote, "Sometimes, life teaches us the inside out. That absence teaches us more than presence, that loss reveals who we truly are. And that loving is also accepting that we won't always get a second chance." Life never again brought them face to face. It was as if the universe understood that what needed to be said had already been said. That stories that begin together don't necessarily have to end side by side. Jason continued his journey as a father, as a companion, as a man who loved, lost, and relearned. Emily continued as a woman who destroyed, mourned, and rebuilt. And with each new step, they both carried within them not resentment, but the wisdom that some loves are eternal, but not forever. If you've made it this far, with a heavy heart and perhaps a little teary-eyed, I invite you to leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. What was the moment that touched you most? What lesson do you take from it? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new stories like this. And remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person, it corrodes us from within, destroys trust, erodes respect, and turns love into silence. Cheating is choosing to lose what's true for something that almost always doesn't last. Here on the channel, we do not support any kind of betrayal. The stories are fictional, but the feelings they evoke are real, and the lesson they teach is clear. it's never worth hurting someone who truly loves you. Thanks for listening to the end. See you in the next story.